You have been living under a sentence you did not consciously choose, executing a pattern you did not deliberately design, paying a debt whose original transaction you cannot even remember. The word karma has been used to explain every persistent failure, every recurring loss, every door that closes at the precise moment it should open, as if the universe were keeping a ledger of ancient wrongs and collecting on them with compound interest through the circumstances of your current life. Florence Scovel Shinn demolished this interpretation with the precision of a master metaphysician. Karma is not a punishment system. It is a law of correspondence, and like every law, it has a mechanism of supersession. Shinn called it the law of grace, and she was unambiguous. Grace does not reduce the debt. Grace does not negotiate a payment plan. Grace revokes the sentence entirely, not eventually, not through years of compensatory suffering. Now, you have worked on your beliefs. You have cleared your patterns. You have forgiven, released, and renewed. You have done the inner work with a sincerity that no one can question and a consistency that few practitioners sustain. And still, something in the architecture of your experience feels as though it was written before you arrived, as if a contract exists that your conscious efforts cannot reach, the financial ceiling that resets at a specific threshold, the relationship that develops to a precise point of intimacy, and then, by whatever mechanism the circumstances arrange, dissolves. The health, the opportunity, the forward momentum that reaches a familiar altitude and then encounters a familiar resistance. You have done everything that should have changed these patterns. You have done it well. They remain. This feeling of operating against a pre-existing constraint is not imagination. And Florence Scovel Shinn was clear on this point. There are patterns that operate below the level of this lifetime's choices. Imprints established in the deep record of consciousness that continue generating corresponding external conditions, not because you are maintaining them consciously, but because they were established at a depth that conscious effort, however sincere, cannot reach from the same level at which the effort is being made. Shinn understood that karma is not theological mythology. It is the law of cause and effect operating across the full continuum of consciousness, and it generates its effects with the same mechanical fidelity that gravity generates its effects. You cannot argue with gravity from the ground. You must operate from a different law. But Shinn also taught, and this is the precise reason you are here today, that the mechanism designed to supersede those deep patterns exists at a level equally deep, and that accessing it requires not years of karmic repayment, not decades of compensatory suffering, not the gradual accumulation of sufficient spiritual merit. It requires the precise activation of a law that Shinn considered the most powerful force available to the human consciousness. The law of grace is not a spiritual concept. It is not a theological promise about eventual divine forgiveness. It is an operative mechanism, a law that stands above the law of cause and effect in the same way that a sovereign pardon stands above the verdict of a court. And it can be engaged with complete authority today. In this video, we will establish Shinn's precise distinction between the law of karma and the law of grace, not as theological concepts, but as operative mechanisms with specific conditions of activation. We will examine the internal architecture of each law, the conditions under which karma maintains its authority over the practitioner's experience and the exact conditions under which grace supersedes that authority entirely. We will construct the protocol that allows you to consciously invoke grace as the superseding law over any karmic pattern currently running in your experience, moving from the passive endurance of inherited patterns into the sovereign activation of the law that was designed to dissolve them. This is not a general discussion of spiritual principles. It is a precise operational sequence. We will then move into the structural mechanics of how this invocation is properly performed. The preparation, the declaration, and the critical discipline of release that determines whether what you have spoken is a genuine invocation or simply another affirmation operating at the same level as the pattern it is attempting to dissolve. Each step has a specific function. Each function has a specific reason. The architecture will be explained with the precision it deserves, because imprecision in the invocation of this law is not a minor inefficiency. It is the difference between activating the superseding authority and reinforcing the sentence you are attempting to revoke. But before we reach the protocol, there is a specific error that Shinn identified, an error so embedded in the sincere student that most practitioners are actively maintaining it in the very act of trying to invoke grace. It is not an error of effort. It is not an error of sincerity. It is a structural error, a posture of consciousness that, however quietly it is held, functions as the precise mechanism that keeps the karmic law operative, even while the practitioner believes they are invoking the law designed to supersede it. We will identify it exactly in Part 4, with the diagnostic precision it requires. If this law is now yours, if you have already recognized that what is being established here is operative, not merely interesting, then make that recognition complete before this work continues. Write the words, "Grace is my law," in the comments below, not as a reaction to the content, as a decree, as the formal declaration that the superseding authority has been claimed. The law responds to declaration. Issue it now. Florence Scovel Shinn operated within the New Thought tradition with a precision that set her apart from many of her contemporaries. Where others spoke in the language of aspiration and positive thinking, Shinn spoke in the language of law. She understood and documented with remarkable specificity that the universe is not a system of divine preferences and occasional rewards. It is a system of absolute correspondence, operating according to laws as precise as the laws that govern chemistry, physics, or mathematics. Chief among those laws in Shinn's cosmology is the law of cause and effect, the principle that every condition established in consciousness will, with mathematical fidelity, generate a corresponding condition in external experience. This is karma in its most technically precise form. Not a moral judgment, not a divine punishment, but a law of correspondence operating without exception. Shinn was careful to distinguish between the law of cause and effect as it operates within a single lifetime and its operation across what she described as the full continuum of consciousness. The pattern you identify in your current experience, the specific recurring architecture that has reconstituted itself across different circumstances, different relationships, different financial instruments, different physical conditions, was not necessarily established in this lifetime at all. The imprint that is generating these corresponding conditions may have been established in the deep record of consciousness at a point far earlier than your earliest conscious memory. It continues to operate not because you are choosing to maintain it, but because it was crystallized at a depth that operates below the level of conscious choice entirely. The law does not require your cooperation to continue generating its effects. It only requires the unrevoked presence of its original cause. This is the precise reason that conventional approaches to pattern dissolution, approaches that operate at the level of conscious belief, conscious affirmation, conscious visualization, produce results that are often impressive at the surface and yet leave the deepest patterns intact. You are working on the effect from within the same system of laws that is producing it. Shinn used an analogy that illuminates this perfectly. You cannot dissolve a mold by rearranging the material it is currently shaping. The material is an effect of the mold. The mold is the cause. To change the material permanently, you must address the mold directly, and the mold, in this case, operates at a depth below the level at which most practitioners have been working. Shinn taught that karma, understood correctly, is neither punitive nor personal in its operation. It is impersonal, as all law is impersonal. Gravity does not favor the faithful. The law of cause and effect does not punish the wicked and reward the virtuous. It corresponds without deviation to whatever pattern has been established as cause, regardless of who established it, when it was established, or whether the current consciousness inhabiting the pattern has any awareness of its origin. The pattern runs because patterns run. That is the law. Understanding this removes the emotional charge from the recognition of karmic debt, the shame, the self-judgment, the exhausting search for the original sin. The pattern is not evidence of your unworthiness. It is evidence of an unrevoked cause. Those are fundamentally different diagnoses with fundamentally different solutions. The solution in Shinn's framework is the law of grace. And here, the precision of Shinn's teaching becomes extraordinary because she did not treat grace as a vague divine intervention or an unpredictable act of cosmic mercy. She treated it as a law, a higher law and superseding law, but a law nonetheless, which means it operates according to specific conditions and produces specific effects when those conditions are met. The law of grace in Shinn's teaching is the direct action of what she called the infinite upon the karmic record, not the reduction of the debt, not the scheduling of a more manageable repayment plan, but the unconditional dissolution of the entire pattern at the level of its original cause. Grace does not work at the level of effect. It operates at the level where the cause was established. This distinction, grace as law rather than grace as mercy, is the axis on which everything else in this video turns. If grace is an unpredictable act of divine favor, then it cannot be invoked with precision. It can only be hoped for, prayed for, waited for. And this waiting posture is itself, as Shinn would note, a condition that keeps the karmic pattern operative by defaulting to the law of limitation rather than the law of supersession. But if grace is a law, if it operates according to precise conditions that can be deliberately established by the practitioner, then it is not a matter of divine lottery. It is a matter of correct application. And correct application is a matter of understanding the mechanism. The mechanism of grace, as Shinn documented it, operates through what she described as the complete surrender of personal will to the authority of the infinite in the specific area where the karmic pattern is active. This is not a general attitude of spiritual openness. It is a precise, targeted release of the personal will's claim on the outcome in the exact domain where the karmic imprint has been generating its corresponding conditions. Shinn was specific. Grace cannot be commanded. It can only be invoked. And the invocation is not a forceful assertion of desired outcomes. It is the opposite. It is the conscious, deliberate, and complete opening of the channel through which grace operates, by removing the one obstruction that closes it, the insistence of the personal will on managing the resolution. The distinction between commanding and invoking is not subtle, and Shinn returned to it repeatedly in her teaching. To command is to direct the law from the position of personal will, specifying the outcome, the timeline, and the mechanism. To invoke is to call into operation a law whose authority exceeds your own and to surrender the management of its operation entirely to the intelligence of that law. When a practitioner commands grace, they are not invoking grace. They are projecting their own will outward with spiritual language attached. The karmic pattern recognizes no authority in that projection because the projection is operating at the same level as the pattern itself. Genuine invocation places the resolution in the hands of a power operating above the level of the pattern. That power requires no instructions. It requires only access. Access, in Shinn's framework, is established through the specific internal posture she described as conscious receptivity, a state that is active rather than passive, deliberate rather than accidental, and precisely opposite to the grasping, directing quality of personal will. The practitioner who has genuinely established conscious receptivity is not waiting helplessly for grace to arrive. They have made a specific, informed, deliberate choice to release the personal will's management of a specific area of their experience and to operate from the authority of the law of grace instead. This is a decision, not a feeling. It does not require emotional intensity. It requires clarity of understanding and precision of declaration. Shinn believed and documented that the practitioner who understood the law clearly enough to invoke it correctly would find the invocation effective not because they had performed it with sufficient emotion, but because they had performed it with sufficient precision. The conditions of activation for the law of grace are therefore not mysterious, and Shinn did not present them as mysterious. They are specific. They are learnable. They are applicable to any karmic pattern regardless of its age, its depth, or its apparent imperviousness to previous effort. The first condition is the accurate identification of the pattern, not its symptoms, not its current surface form, but its essential architecture. The second condition is the formal acknowledgement of the pattern's karmic reality, the recognition that it has operated beyond the reach of personal effort, stated without shame and without resentment. The third condition is the grace declaration itself, issued from a state of complete release of personal will, with the certainty of someone invoking a law they understand to be real. And the fourth condition, which Shinn considered equally essential to the first three, is the complete and sustained release of the outcome's form following the declaration. These four conditions, properly established, constitute the full invocation. When all four are present, the law of grace is operative. When anyone is absent or compromised, the invocation is incomplete. What Shinn was describing in the language of her time is the most radical operative claim in the entire tradition of New Thought metaphysics. That a practitioner, standing in the present moment of understanding, with nothing but the correct invocation of the correct law, can dissolve a pattern that has been operating in the deep record of consciousness for longer than their current lifetime. This is not a mild claim. This is not a metaphysical nicety. This is a declaration that the authority available to the individual consciousness, properly understood and properly applied, is not merely equal to the karmic pattern it is addressing. It is superior to it. Grace supersedes karma, not eventually, not partially, completely, and now. This claim requires the kind of examination that reveals whether it is true or merely comforting. And that examination is what the remaining portions of this video constitute. We are not asking you to believe this because Shinn said it. We are building the logical structure, the operative protocol, and the evidential framework that allow you to evaluate the claim precisely. By the conclusion of this video, the law of grace will not be a spiritual concept you hold with hopeful uncertainty. It will be a mechanism you understand with the same certainty that you understand how a key works in a lock. The mechanism is precise. The key is in your hand. The only question is whether you understand it accurately enough to use it correctly. The answer to that question begins with understanding the law it supersedes, karma, with the same precision that Shinn brought to her teaching of grace. Because you cannot correctly invoke the superseding authority over a law you have misunderstood. The misunderstanding of karma is not a minor academic error. It is the source of the most common and most costly errors in the invocation of grace, and those errors will be examined in complete detail in Part 4. For now, understand this. Shinn's teaching on karma is not an instruction to accept it as fate. It is a precise diagnosis of a mechanism that has a specific vulnerability to a specific higher law. That law is available to you today. Consider the architecture of a legal debt. In any functional legal system, a debt incurred through an identifiable action generates an obligation that persists until it is discharged. The nature of that discharge can take different forms. The debt can be repaid through equivalent restitution. It can be renegotiated through some arrangement that satisfies both the creditor and the court, or it can be restructured in ways that extend its resolution across time. These are the mechanisms available within the system of law that recognize the debt in the first place. They are the conventional instruments of resolution. They work, they are reliable, and they operate entirely within the authority of the original law, which means they require the full engagement of the system that imposed the obligation in the first place. The karma analogy is exact. Conventional spiritual practices aimed at karmic resolution are operating within the system. They are attempting to repay the debt through equivalent experience, through suffering, through learning, through the gradual accumulation of compensatory consciousness. They work after a fashion, but they are slow and they are painful, and they require the full term of the sentence. But above every court system, in every jurisdiction that has ever existed, there is a mechanism that stands entirely outside the authority of the court. The sovereign pardon. The sovereign pardon does not declare that the debt was never real. It does not argue with the court's findings. It does not present evidence of innocence or negotiate a reduced sentence. It simply revokes the sentence with the authority of a power that stands above the law that imposed it. The court that issued the sentence has no recourse to the pardon. Its authority does not extend to the level at which the pardon operates. The sentence was legal, accurate, and just within the court's jurisdiction, and the pardon supersedes it anyway, because the pardon operates from a jurisdiction that transcends the courts entirely. This is the exact metaphysical structure of the law of grace in Shinn's teaching. Karma is the court. The karmic sentence is real, accurate, and fair within the law that issued it. Grace is the sovereign pardon, and it operates from a level that karma's authority cannot reach. This analogy is not merely illustrative. It carries genuine logical weight that demands examination because the logic reveals something important about the conditions under which the pardon is issued. In the legal system, the sovereign pardon is not issued automatically. It is issued in response to a specific petition, a formal request made through the correct channel by someone with standing to make it. The petition must be correctly addressed, correctly framed, and issued by someone who understands the authority to which they are petitioning. A petition submitted to the wrong authority produces nothing. A petition submitted in the wrong form is dismissed. A petition submitted by someone who does not understand that the sovereign authority stands above the court achieves nothing, because the petitioner has not correctly identified who they are petitioning or why that petition has force. The invocation of grace operates by the same logic. You have standing, you have direct access to the superseding authority, but the invocation must be correctly addressed, correctly framed, and issued from the position of someone who genuinely understands that the authority being invoked stands above the law that issued the sentence. Shinn taught that the infinite, her term for the first cause from which all law proceeds, including both the law of karma and the law of grace, is not a distant authority that must be petitioned through elaborate ritual or approached through intermediaries. It is the very substance of the consciousness you are already using to understand these words. The Supreme Court, in this analogy, is not elsewhere. It is here, operating as the deepest layer of your own awareness. The authority that issues the sovereign pardon is not outside you. It is the ultimate nature of what you are when the personal will, with its limited jurisdiction, is set aside. This is why Shinn was so insistent that grace cannot be invoked from the position of personal will. The personal will operates at the level of the court, at the level of cause and effect, karma, and the law of correspondence. It has no standing to issue a pardon because it is itself subject to the sentence it is attempting to revoke. To invoke grace, you must, for the duration of the invocation, operate from the level at which the pardoning authority resides. And that level is precisely the level that the personal will, when released, reveals. The mathematical precision of this structure is what makes it both so powerful and so easily misapplied. The law is exact. Its conditions are specific. When those conditions are met, the result is not uncertain. The karmic pattern is dissolved with the same reliability that any law produces its corresponding effect when its conditions are correctly established. But the conditions require a posture of consciousness that runs directly counter to the posture most practitioners adopt when they are in pain, when the pattern has been operative for decades, and when the urgency of resolution is at its highest. At precisely the moment when the practitioner most needs to release the personal will, the pattern's longevity and its costs create the maximum pressure to grasp harder, to assert more forcefully, to demand resolution with greater intensity. That grasping, however sincere and however spiritually dressed, is the personal will asserting itself at the level of the court. It does not reach the pardoning authority. It reinforces the sentence. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is the exact truth, and it is the reason that the diagnostic work in Part 4 is as essential as the protocol in Part 3. The unshakable logic of grace as superseding law can be stated in the following sequence, and this sequence should be understood as mechanism rather than metaphor. First, every persistent pattern in your experience corresponds to an unrevoked cause established in consciousness at some point in its history. Second, that cause operates below the level at which conventional conscious effort, affirmation, visualization, belief shifting, emotional clearing has authority. Third, there exists a law operating above that level, the law of grace, whose authority is sufficient to dissolve the cause unconditionally. Fourth, that law operates through specific conditions of invocation that can be deliberately established. Fifth, when those conditions are established, the dissolution of the pattern is not a hope. It is a consequence of the law. This is Shinn's teaching in its most reduced, most precise form. Everything in the rest of this video is an elaboration of one or more of these 5 logical steps. Keep the sequence present as the foundation for everything that follows. The second pillar of this logical structure is the principle of non-interference following the invocation, what might be called in systems language the clean execution condition. When a computer program is executing a process, the most reliable way to corrupt the output is to interrupt the process with competing instructions while it is running. The process requires a clean execution environment. Competing commands do not refine the output, they corrupt it. Grace, as Shinn described it, requires the equivalent of a clean execution environment. Once the invocation has been issued, any subsequent attempt by the personal will to manage, monitor, or modify the resolution is a competing instruction introduced into a process that required clean execution. The result is not a refined resolution, it is an interrupted one. The karmic pattern, which has been operating in the subconscious soil for longer than the practitioner's current lifetime in some cases, does not yield to an invocation that is immediately followed by anxious surveillance. The anxious surveillance is itself evidence that the personal will has re-entered the process, that the release was not complete, that the grace invocation was not fully issued, and that the karmic law retains its operative authority because the precise condition required to supersede it was not fully established. This is not a discouraging analysis. It is a precise one, and precision in the application of any law is the difference between the law producing its result and the practitioner concluding incorrectly that the law does not work. The law works. It has always worked. The question is whether it has been correctly invoked. Florence Scovel Shinn spent her career demonstrating that it could be that ordinary practitioners without specialized training or exceptional spiritual gifts could learn to invoke the law of grace with sufficient precision to produce the dissolution of patterns that had resisted every conventional effort. Her case studies are not anecdotal. They are documented demonstrations of a law producing its precise effect when its precise conditions were met. That is the tradition you are entering. That is the standard of precision to which this work holds you. And that precision begins with the architectural examination of how the invocation is properly constructed. The karmic pattern is real. The debt it represents is real. And the grace that supersedes it is not merely equally real. It is, in Shinn's framework, more fundamentally real, because it operates at the level of first cause, rather than at the level of effect. Karma is an effect of the law of cause and effect. Grace is an expression of the first cause from which all law proceeds. When you invoke grace, you are not invoking a remedy created to counteract a problem. You are invoking the original authority, the foundational operating principle from which both the karmic law and its supersession derive their reality. The karmic sentence was issued by a court that derives its authority from the infinite. Grace is the infinite itself acting directly. The court's authority is derivative. The pardoning authority is original. This distinction matters because it means the invocation of grace is not an attempt to circumvent reality. It is an appeal to the most fundamental layer of reality. There is nothing more real than what Shinn called the infinite operating through the consciousness that has correctly opened itself to receive it. Invoke the sovereign authority. The sentence is revoked. The logic holds in every direction from which it is examined. If there is a law of cause and effect, and there is, and it produces its results with mechanical consistency, then the existence of a law operating above it is not only possible, but structurally necessary, because every system of laws, in every domain of knowledge, is embedded within a larger system from which it derives its authority, and by whose higher principles it can be superseded. In physics, Newtonian mechanics is superseded by relativistic mechanics. In jurisprudence, local law is superseded by constitutional authority. In metaphysics, the law of cause and effect, karma, is superseded by the law of grace. This is not a special pleading for a desired outcome. This is the structural logic of how layered systems of law operate. Grace is not an exception to the order of things. It is a higher expression of that order. Shinn understood this, and her understanding produced results that the conventional interpretation of karma as an inescapable sentence to be served has never produced with comparable reliability. The foundational question, before we proceed to the protocol, is therefore not whether the law of grace is real. The logical structure establishes its reality with sufficient precision. The foundational question is whether you understand it clearly enough to invoke it correctly. That understanding requires the operational knowledge of parts 3 and 4. It requires the diagnostic precision of knowing what correct invocation looks like and what it does not look like. And it requires the honest self-examination of identifying which specific karmic pattern you are bringing to this invocation, naming it with the clinical precision of a diagnostician, rather than the emotional weight of someone who has carried it as a personal wound for years or decades. That is the work that begins now. Before the law of grace can become operative in your experience, before the formal invocation can function as a genuine revocation rather than a sophisticated affirmation operating at the same level as the pattern it is addressing, a specific internal condition must first be established. Florence Scovel Shinn called this condition complete surrender of personal will. And the precision of that phrase demands immediate clarification because the word surrender carries connotations that are exactly opposite to what Shinn meant. Surrender in conventional usage implies defeat. It implies the exhaustion of options, the resignation of the will that has fought and failed. That is not the surrender Shinn described. The surrender she described is the active, sovereign, deliberate choice of a consciousness that has assessed the situation with full clarity and determined that the correct next action is to release the personal will's management of a specific domain and to transfer that management to an authority that operates above the level at which the personal will has been working. This is not weakness. It is strategic intelligence of the highest order. The distinction between passive resignation and active sovereign release is not a semantic nicety. It is the precise distinction between an invocation that activates the law of grace and a collapse that simply leaves the karmic pattern without any operative authority at all. The practitioner who surrenders personal will from exhaustion, who releases control because they have run out of effort, out of ideas, out of emotional reserves, is not establishing the condition for grace to operate. They are establishing the condition for chaos because the personal will has been withdrawn, but the consciousness has not been correctly aligned with the superseding authority to which it should be yielding. Genuine surrender in Shinn's sense is the opposite of exhaustion. It is the fully informed, fully intentional act of a practitioner who understands that the authority they are surrendering to is more capable of resolving the pattern than the authority they are surrendering from. It is the decision of a sovereign, not the collapse of a defeated soldier. The internal preparation, therefore, begins with a specific act of understanding, what might be called the honest inventory. You must identify with complete precision the area of your experience where the karmic pattern is operative. Not in the general language of financial lack or relationship difficulty. Those are categories, not patterns. A pattern has specific architectural features. It appears at specific thresholds. It reconstitutes itself through specific mechanisms. It produces specific types of loss or limitation rather than general deprivation. The more precisely you can describe the architecture of the pattern, the more precisely your consciousness can direct the invocation of grace at its actual location. Shinn was not teaching a general spiritual practice of openness and positivity. She was teaching a surgical operation. Surgical precision requires surgical identification of the site. Once the pattern has been identified with sufficient precision, the next element of the internal preparation is what Shinn described as the honest acknowledgement that the pattern has operated beyond the reach of personal effort. This acknowledgement is not a confession of failure, it is an accurate diagnostic statement. The personal will has attempted to address this pattern. It has attempted to address it sincerely, with legitimate tools, applied with genuine discipline, and the pattern has remained intact. This is not a shameful outcome. It is the expected outcome of applying effort at the level of effect to a cause that operates at a deeper level. The acknowledgement is the recognition of that diagnostic reality. The tools available at the level of personal will have a ceiling of authority, and this pattern exceeds that ceiling. Something with greater authority is required. That recognition, stated clearly, without self-judgment, without resentment, is the specific internal posture that constitutes the beginning of true receptivity to grace. Shinn taught that the practitioner who arrives at this preparatory state with genuine, non-dramatic clarity, not theatrical surrender, not emotional distress, but clean, accurate recognition, has already established the most critical condition for grace's activation. The entire architecture of the remaining preparation is built upon that foundation. Without it, every subsequent step in the protocol will be performed from a position of partial personal will, a position where the practitioner is simultaneously attempting to invoke a law that requires the absence of personal will management, while maintaining enough personal will management to ensure the invocation goes according to their preferred timeline and form. This contradiction is invisible from within the personal will's perspective, which is precisely why Shinn considered the preparatory phase as important as the declaration itself. You cannot stand on 2 floors of a building at the same time. You must choose the floor from which you are operating. Choose it clearly before you speak the decree. The final element of the internal preparation, and the one that Shinn described as the most consistently neglected by practitioners who were otherwise performing the invocation correctly, is what she called the clearing of the emotional residue of the pattern itself. The pattern that has operated for years or decades has cost you something. It has cost you financial accumulation that should have been yours. It has cost you relationships whose absence has structured the emotional landscape of your adult life. It has cost you health, momentum, opportunity, and years. The emotional record of those costs is real, and Shinn did not ask the practitioner to deny it. She asked the practitioner to recognize that maintaining that emotional residue, the grief, the resentment, the exhausted frustration of repetition, in consciousness at the moment of invocation, is to introduce a competing signal into the channel through which grace must operate. The emotional residue says, in the language of the deep, subjective mind, this pattern has been real, has been painful, and its effects are still present. Grace says, the pattern is revoked. You cannot issue both communications simultaneously from the same consciousness. The preparation requires the deliberate, conscious clearing of that residue, not its permanent suppression, but its specific suspension at the moment of invocation, long enough for the decree to be issued cleanly. This clearing is not an emotional process requiring weeks of therapeutic work before the grace invocation can be legitimately performed. It is a specific act of the trained will, the deliberate choice in this moment to set down the emotional record of the pattern and to approach the invocation from the position of someone who has already accepted, in principle, that the pattern is ending. Shinn described this posture as coming to the decree already believing in the decree's authority, not believing that the outcome is certain in the specific form you desire. That would reintroduce conditional personal will, believing that the authority you are invoking is real, operative, and sufficient for the dissolution of whatever the pattern has established. That belief, established clearly, is the emotional foundation from which the invocation can be spoken with genuine force. The preparation phase, fully established, has the following characteristics as its internal signature: a specific and accurate identification of the pattern being addressed, a clean, non-judgmental acknowledgement that the pattern has exceeded the authority of personal effort, the deliberate choice to release personal will's management of the resolution, and the suspension of the emotional residue of the pattern's history long enough to speak the decree from a position of present authority rather than accumulated pain. When these four internal conditions are present, the practitioner is standing at what Shinn called the threshold, the precise point at which the personal will has stepped aside and the channel to the superseding authority has been opened. This is not a metaphorical state. It has a specific, subjective quality, a quality of quiet, of spaciousness, of something that is not quite stillness, but is the closest human consciousness approaches to the stillness of the infinite in the midst of active life. Shinn's practitioners described it consistently as the feeling of something being held rather than pushed, of the outcome being contained rather than pursued. When you feel that quality, you are ready. Speak the decree. The preparation cannot be rushed, but it also cannot be indefinitely delayed. The practitioner who waits for perfect emotional clarity before invoking grace has confused preparation with perfection and has allowed the perfect to become the enemy of the operative. Shinn was practical in a way that distinguished her from more abstract metaphysicians. She understood that practitioners are living in the middle of their patterns, surrounded by the circumstances those patterns have generated, subject to the ongoing costs of those patterns' operation. She did not expect her students to achieve a state of transcendence before they could invoke the law of transcendence. She expected them to achieve a state of sufficient clarity, clarity enough to name the pattern precisely, to release the personal will's management genuinely, and to speak the decree from a position of sincere recognition of the authority being invoked. Sufficient clarity is achievable today in the circumstances you currently occupy, in the life you are currently living. That is the entire point of grace as operative law rather than grace as eventual divine reward. It is available in the present moment to the consciousness that is present in this moment, with this understanding, performing this invocation. What this preparation reveals, when it is fully and honestly performed, is something Shinn considered both the most challenging and the most liberating truth in the entire teaching of grace: that the primary resistance to the law of grace is not located in the karmic pattern itself. The pattern is passive. It runs because it has not been superseded. It does not actively resist supersession. It simply continues until something with greater authority intervenes. The primary resistance to the law of grace is located in the practitioner's own consciousness, in the form of the personal will's attachment to managing the resolution. The pattern will yield the moment the superseding authority is genuinely invoked. The challenge is not the pattern. The challenge is the practitioner's readiness to invoke with a completeness of release that genuine invocation requires. This recognition is not discouraging. It is enormously empowering because it locates the operative variable exactly where you have direct access to it, in your own consciousness, in your own decision about how to hold your next moment of awareness. That decision is available to you right now. The first step in the Grace Invocation Protocol is the pattern identification, and Shinn's requirement here is the same requirement that a skilled attorney brings to the drafting of a legal document: absolute specificity. You are not naming a category of difficulty. You are naming a precise architectural feature of your experience, a specific recurring mechanism with identifiable characteristics that has demonstrated its persistence across multiple surface configurations. Financial difficulty is not a pattern identification. A pattern identification sounds like this: a pattern of accumulation reaching a specific threshold of approximately $30,000 in liquid reserves, followed by a sudden, unanticipated expense or loss that returns the balance to near zero, which has occurred in identifiably similar form 6 times across a span of 23 years through 3 different careers in 2 different countries. That is a pattern identification. The specificity is not arbitrary fastidiousness. The precision of the identification is the precision of the revocation. The decree of grace is not issued against a vague field of limitation. It is issued against a specific, named, precisely described karmic architecture. The law responds to the decree with the same precision that the decree names its subject. Name it exactly. The precision of the pattern identification also performs a function that Shinn considered essential for the psychological preparation of the practitioner. It separates the pattern from the practitioner's identity. When the pattern is named vaguely, "I have always struggled financially," it functions as a statement of identity. It says, "This is who I am." The law of the subconscious mind takes that statement as a command and continues to generate circumstances that confirm it. When the pattern is named precisely, this specific architectural feature has operated in my experience under these specific conditions since approximately this point in time. It functions as a statement of external fact about something that has been present in your experience but is not constitutive of your identity. You are not the pattern. You are the consciousness that is now issuing a decree against a pattern that has operated in your field of experience. That distinction between being the pattern and observing and naming the pattern is the psychological shift that makes genuine invocation possible. You cannot invoke grace against something you believe you are. You can only invoke grace against something you recognize as separate from what you are. The second step in the protocol is the formal acknowledgement, and its function is as precise as its form. Shinn taught that before grace can supersede the karmic law, the karmic reality must be formally acknowledged, stated in consciousness with the calm, legal recognition of a practitioner who is reading a document they are fully prepared to supersede. This acknowledgement takes a specific 3-part form. First, an acknowledgement that the pattern has been operative in your experience, stated as fact, without shame and without resentment, with the tone of a diagnostician confirming a finding. Second, an acknowledgement that the pattern has operated beyond the reach of personal effort, that it has survived the application of every tool available at the level of cause and effect, and has remained intact. Third, an acknowledgement that you are now invoking a law operating above the level at which the pattern has been maintained, and that you do so with the understanding that this law's authority is sufficient for the pattern's complete dissolution. These three acknowledgments constitute the legal preamble to the revocation, and Shinn was clear that their function is not confessional, but procedural. You are not admitting guilt. You are establishing the factual basis upon which the superseding authority is being invoked. The formal acknowledgement also performs an important function that is less immediately obvious, but equally essential. It closes the escape routes that the personal will typically uses to avoid genuine surrender. The practitioner who skips the acknowledgement and moves directly to the declaration has typically done so because they are uncomfortable with the admission that their personal effort has not been sufficient to dissolve the pattern. The discomfort is understandable. These are practitioners who have invested decades of sincere work in their spiritual development, and the acknowledgement that a specific pattern has operated beyond the reach of that work can feel like a betrayal of everything they have built. But the discomfort is itself evidence that the personal will is still managing the process, still protecting its self-conception as the adequate authority, and that the opening required for grace to operate has not yet been fully established. The formal acknowledgement, performed with genuine honesty, dismantles that defense. It is the act of a consciousness mature enough to recognize that the authority of the personal will has a ceiling, and wise enough to seek the authority that operates above it. The third and central step in the protocol is the grace declaration itself. This is the decree, the formal invocation of the superseding authority. Shinn's formulation in its essential structure is this: the law of grace now supersedes every karmic pattern operating in my consciousness regarding this specific condition. The debt is revoked. The sentence is dissolved. Divine order is now established as the only operative law in this area of my life. The form of the declaration matters. Now is not a chronological specification. It is an assertion of present tense operative reality. Supersedes is not a request that grace eventually become active. It is the recognition that the law is being invoked and is therefore operative at this moment. The debt is revoked is not a petition for revocation. It is a statement of a fact about what the invocation of this law produces. Divine order is now established, is the positive assertion of what replaces the karmic pattern once the revocation is complete. Every word in the declaration carries a specific functional weight, and the practitioner who understands that weight speaks the declaration with a quality of certainty that is not manufactured, but derived from all understanding. The declaration is spoken once. Shinn was absolute on this point, and her reasoning is mechanically precise. A decree issued with genuine authority does not require repetition. Repetition of the declaration is, in the language of Shinn's teaching, evidence that the practitioner has not genuinely recognized the authority of the law they are invoking. If you write your signature on a legal document once with genuine intent, the document is signed. If you write it again because you are not sure the first signature was valid, you have raised a question about the authority of the signature itself. A practitioner who repeats the grace declaration 10 times in a row because once does not feel sufficient has demonstrated through the very act of repetition that they have not established the internal condition of genuine surrender that the declaration requires. The repetition is the personal will reintroducing itself into the process, attempting to accumulate sufficient force through volume rather than operating from the position of authority that makes a single, clear declaration sufficient. Speak it once. Speak it with the certainty of someone invoking a law they understand to be real. Then silence. The fourth and final step of the protocol is the complete and sustained release of the outcome's form following the declaration. This step is not a postscript to the invocation. It is as essential to the invocation's effectiveness as any of the preceding steps. Grace, as Shinn taught it, operates through the most efficient pathway available to the universal intelligence. And that pathway is never, in Shinn's documented experience, limited to the pathway that the personal mind has designated as the appropriate form of resolution. The practitioner who invokes grace for the dissolution of a financial pattern while simultaneously holding a firm internal picture that the resolution must come through a specific business deal, a specific inheritance, or a specific career development has not released the outcome. They have released it on the condition that it arrives through the designated channel. That is a conditional release, and a conditional release is not a release at all. It is a partial surrender with a hidden agenda. Grace does not negotiate with hidden agendas. It operates through complete openness, or it waits until complete openness is established. The sustained quality of the release is equally important. It is not sufficient to release the outcome at the moment of the declaration and then reintroduce surveillance of the resolution process 2 hours later. Shinn described the correct posture following the invocation as what she called watchful non-interference, a state in which the practitioner continues to live fully, to act intelligently in the directions that present themselves, and to remain observant of the ways in which the resolution begins to manifest, while maintaining complete non-interference with the mechanism of the resolution itself. This means that when circumstances begin to shift in the direction of the pattern's dissolution, the practitioner observes without grasping. When the resolution begins to take a form that the personal will would not have chosen, the practitioner accepts without resistance. When the timeline of the resolution differs from the timeline the personal mind would have imposed, the practitioner trusts the law rather than the plan. Watchful non-interference is the discipline of someone who has genuinely invoked a higher authority and genuinely yielded management of the outcome to that authority. It is the operational proof that the invocation was real. The three-step structure: pattern identification, formal acknowledgement, grace declaration, followed by the complete and sustained release, constitutes what Shinn considered the complete technical sequence for the invocation of grace as operative law. It is not a complex ritual. It has no specific time requirement. It requires no physical preparation, no special environment, no accumulated spiritual merit. It requires only the internal preparation described in Part 3.1 and the execution precision described here. What it does require, and what Shinn considered the practitioner's most important act of discipline in the entire process, is the honest self-assessment of whether each step has been performed with the genuine quality that the step requires. Whether the pattern identification is truly specific or merely general, whether the formal acknowledgement has been genuinely honest or quietly self-protective, whether the grace declaration was spoken from a position of genuine surrender or from a position of personal will dressed in the language of surrender, and whether the release following the declaration is complete or conditional. That self-assessment is not self-criticism. It is the same precision that a surgeon applies to the verification of their own procedure. Not judgment, but accuracy. The accuracy of the invocation determines the completeness of the result. The error that Shinn identified as the most pervasive, the most deeply embedded, and the most systematically destructive to the invocation of grace is one that, by its very nature, is invisible to the practitioner who is maintaining it. It is invisible because it masquerades as sincere spiritual effort. It wears the language of the very teaching it is undermining, and it operates with particular intensity in precisely the practitioners who have been the most sincere, the most disciplined, and the most earnest in their pursuit of spiritual understanding, which means it operates with particular intensity in you. Shinn named this era the repayment posture, and she documented its effects with the precision of someone who had seen it destroy otherwise correct invocations hundreds of times. The repayment posture is the unconscious assumption held below the level of explicit belief that the karmic debt must still be partially repaid before it can be legitimately revoked. That some amount of suffering must first be endured, some degree of demonstrated worthiness must first be accumulated, some period of compensatory difficulty must first be served before the grace declaration can be spoken and received as the genuine supersession of the pattern. The practitioner who holds the repayment posture does not experience it as a belief. They experience it as a feeling, a quiet, persistent sense that invoking grace at this particular moment, before they have suffered enough, before they have learned enough, before they have demonstrated sufficient spiritual seriousness, is somehow presumptuous. That it is asking for something that has not yet been earned, that the decree would be premature. This feeling is precisely what the karmic law feels like from within. The law of cause and effect, operating as karmic pattern, has a specific subjective signature. The sense that the current difficulty is appropriate, that it corresponds to some accumulated debt, that it would be spiritually dishonest to attempt to dissolve it before it has run its natural course. This sense is not wisdom. It is the voice of the very law that the invocation of grace is designed to supersede, operating at the level of consciousness that it needs to occupy in order to maintain its authority. The karmic pattern does not resist grace by producing circumstances that block grace. It resists grace by producing the feeling that grace is not yet legitimate, the feeling that the sentence is still deserved, that the debt is still owed, that the invocation would be premature. And the sincere practitioner, mistaking this feeling for spiritual discernment, waits, and the pattern runs. Shinn's counter to the repayment posture was absolute and unequivocal. The law of grace operates on unconditional authority. It requires no preliminary suffering. It requires no proof of worthiness. It requires no demonstration that the practitioner has learned the lesson that the pattern was allegedly teaching. These requirements are conditions imposed by the law of cause and effect, and the law of grace, by definition, supersedes the law of cause and effect, which means it supersedes its conditions entirely. To require that a certain amount of suffering be endured before grace can legitimately operate is to require that the pardoning authority wait for the court to determine when the sentence has been sufficiently served before the pardon can take effect. The pardoning authority has no such obligation. It operates above the court's jurisdiction entirely. And the practitioner who believes that some preliminary suffering is required before grace can be invoked is at that moment operating entirely within the court's jurisdiction, which is precisely the jurisdiction that grace was designed to supersede. The diagnostic test for the repayment posture is specific, and Shinn applied it to her students regularly. Ask yourself this question honestly. As you prepare to issue the grace declaration for the specific pattern you have identified, do you feel at any level that invoking grace right now, without a period of prior suffering, without demonstrated improvement, without evidence that the lesson of the pattern has been learned, is somehow too soon, too easy, or somehow not fully earned? If the answer is yes, in any degree, you are holding the repayment posture, and the declaration you are about to speak will not be spoken from the position of genuine surrender to the superseding authority. It will be spoken as a performance, a verbal invocation overlaid on an internal belief that the law being invoked should not yet apply. That contradiction is not resolvable through increased emotional intensity or more careful choice of words. It is resolvable only through the clear recognition that the repayment posture is the voice of the karmic law itself, not the voice of spiritual wisdom, and the deliberate choice to release it before the invocation begins. The second fatal error is what Shinn called the conditional release, and it is the error that most commonly appears in the practitioners who have successfully navigated the repayment posture and arrive at the grace declaration with genuine surrender, only to reintroduce personal will management into the process at the precise moment when its absence is most critical. The conditional release occurs when the practitioner speaks the grace declaration while simultaneously maintaining in the deep subjective mind a specific picture of how the revocation must manifest. The picture may be conscious or unconscious. It may be highly specific. A particular financial figure, a particular person, a particular career trajectory. Or it may be structural. A general requirement that the resolution arrive through a recognizable mechanism on a predictable timeline in a form that the personal mind can verify as genuine. In either case, it functions identically. It reintroduces the personal will's management into the invocation at exactly the point where that management was supposed to have been released. The conditional release is extraordinarily common in practitioners who have studied the law of attraction and its related teachings extensively, which includes virtually every member of this audience. The practice of holding a specific mental picture of the desired outcome has been taught as a fundamental discipline of consciousness work. And for many types of conscious application, it is an appropriate and effective technique. But it is precisely not appropriate in the invocation of grace, because the invocation of grace is not an act of conscious creation through the personal will. It is the release of the personal will's management of a specific domain and the transfer of that management to a law operating above the personal will's jurisdiction. Introducing a specific mental picture of the desired outcome into the invocation of grace is not enhancing the invocation. It is converting it from a grace invocation into a conventional affirmation. And a conventional affirmation operates at the level of cause and effect, which is precisely the level that grace was invoked to supersede. Shinn documented the conditional release in her students with particular concern for a specific variant she observed repeatedly. The practitioner who releases the how but maintains the what in such specific terms that the what itself becomes the mechanism through which personal will management has been preserved. The practitioner believes they have surrendered the mechanism of resolution while retaining the clarity of the desired outcome. And they have, in fact, retained so specific a picture of the outcome that the mechanism of resolution has effectively been specified through the specificity of the outcome. Grace, operating through the universal intelligence, may well resolve the pattern through an outcome whose essential quality matches what the practitioner wanted, but whose specific form they would not have recognized as a match. If the practitioner has specified the outcome in such narrow terms that only one specific form of resolution would be accepted as genuine, they have not released the outcome. They have simply hidden the conditional release inside the specificity of the desired result. The correct invocation names the pattern being revoked and the general quality of the divine order that is replacing it, and releases every specific detail of form, timing, and mechanism entirely. The identification of these two errors, the repayment posture and the conditional release, should be received not as a discouraging assessment of how many ways grace can fail to activate, but as a liberating specification of exactly where the practitioner's work is required. Most practitioners who have failed to activate grace in their experience have been making one or both of these errors consistently, not because they are spiritually inadequate, not because the law is inaccessible to them, but because they were applying the correct law with an incorrect internal posture and without being shown the precise nature of the posture error. They had no mechanism for correcting it. You have now been shown the precise nature of both errors. The corrective action is the specific, honest self-examination of whether you are holding either posture and the deliberate choice to release whichever one is present before you perform the invocation. This is not a lifetime of additional work. It is a single, clear decision. Make it with the same precision with which Shinn made the distinction. Shinn's teaching on the nature of grace as the highest operative law in the human practitioner's toolkit is built on a single foundational understanding that, once genuinely held, reorganizes the entire architecture of the practitioner's relationship to their experience. The understanding that grace is not the exception to the order of things, but the highest expression of it. Most practitioners, even those who have studied Shinn carefully, carry a residual sense that grace is a special case, that it operates in extraordinary circumstances for the extraordinary practitioner or the extraordinary petition. This is precisely incorrect. Grace is not extraordinary. It is the most fundamental force available to human consciousness precisely because it operates from the level of first cause, from the level at which all other laws derive their reality, and from which all other laws can therefore be superseded. It is not reserved for the desperate, the exceptional, or the spiritually advanced. It is available to any consciousness that understands its authority with sufficient clarity to invoke it correctly. There is a power that supersedes karma, supersedes the law of cause and effect, supersedes every pattern established through ignorance or fear in the history of your consciousness. That power is grace, the direct action of the infinite upon the record of the past, dissolving what the personal will could not dissolve, freeing what every human effort could not free. It is not a distant theological concept. It is the most immediately accessible law available to you, because accessing it requires not the accumulation of spiritual merit, not the passage of time, not the performance of elaborate ritual, but only the precision of understanding and the completeness of invocation that this teaching provides. Shinn was not describing a distant ideal. She was describing a law she watched operate in the lives of ordinary practitioners, repeatedly, with consistency that she documented because she was a practical teacher working in the tradition of New Thought science. The law works. Your task is to invoke it correctly. The Master's instruction on grace includes a specific guidance on what Shinn called the quality of expectancy that should follow the correct invocation. Expectancy, in Shinn's usage, is not anxious monitoring for evidence of the revocation. It is not hopeful, watching for signs that the pattern is beginning to dissolve. It is something considerably more subtle and considerably more powerful. The relaxed certainty of someone who has issued a decree to a reliable authority and is now proceeding with the normal business of their life in the full understanding that the authority will execute the decree. The analogy Shinn used was the patient who has consulted the most skilled physician available, received the correct treatment, and returned home, not anxiously checking for the first signs of recovery, but living their life with the calm confidence that the treatment is doing what treatments do. They are not monitoring the healing. They are living, and the healing is proceeding because the correct intervention has been correctly administered. This quality of expectancy has a specific and important function in the mechanics of the grace invocation. It maintains the clean execution environment that the invocation requires. The practitioner who invokes grace and then maintains a state of relaxed, confident expectancy is keeping the channel open through which grace continues to operate. The practitioner who invokes grace and then immediately begins monitoring for evidence of the revocation has reintroduced the personal will into the management of the process, has, in effect, taken the matter back from the authority to which it was just surrendered and placed it back under the management of the consciousness that determined it needed to be surrendered in the first place. The monitoring posture and the surrendered posture are mutually exclusive. You cannot simultaneously surrender management of an outcome and actively manage the verification that the surrender is producing results. Choose one posture, maintain it. Shinn documented that the practitioners who maintained genuine expectancy following correct invocation consistently reported that the resolution arrived through mechanisms they would not have predicted, on timelines they would not have imposed, in forms that were recognizably superior to the specific forms their personal will would have specified had they retained management. This was not a coincidence in Shinn's framework. It was the law operating with the intelligence of the infinite, rather than the intelligence of the limited personal mind. The final element of Shinn's master instruction on grace is her teaching on what she called the retrospective confirmation, the recognition of grace operating in the past as a mechanism for deepening the consciousness's trust in grace as an operative law for the present and future. Shinn observed that her students who were most effective at invoking grace were those who had, at some point, recognized moments in their own experience where grace had operated without their conscious invocation, where a pattern that had been heading toward its habitual catastrophic conclusion had instead, through a mechanism that defied conventional explanation, resolved in a way that the law of cause and effect alone could not account for. The recognition of those moments, Shinn taught, is not nostalgia. It is evidence, first-person evidence, that the law of grace is real, that it has already operated in your experience, and that it is therefore available to be invoked consciously going forward. The practitioner who can say with genuine recognition, "I have seen this law work in my own life," has a fundamentally different relationship to the invocation of grace than the practitioner who is invoking it as a theoretical proposition for the first time. The retrospective confirmation transforms the invocation from an act of faith into an act of recognition. And recognition, as Shinn consistently taught, is the most powerful operative posture available to the human consciousness. The science of the 20th and 21st centuries has, with remarkable consistency, produced findings that require the same fundamental revision of the classical mechanistic worldview that Florence Scovel Shinn was calling for in the domain of spiritual law. The parallel is not superficial, and it is not merely analogical. It points towards something deep in the structure of reality itself, that the laws operating at the classical level of observable experience are not the only laws, nor the highest laws, nor the laws with ultimate authority over what is possible within any given system. Above the classical level of mechanics, the level at which cause and effect operate with the familiar determinism of Newton's laws, there exists a level of reality at which those classical constraints simply do not apply in the same way. And the findings that demonstrate this most dramatically are the findings of quantum mechanics, specifically the phenomenon of quantum tunneling. In classical mechanics, the behavior of a particle approaching an energy barrier is fully determined by the energy the particle possesses relative to the height of the barrier. If the particle's kinetic energy is less than the potential energy of the barrier, the particle cannot cross the barrier. This is not a probabilistic statement. It is a statement of classical law, and it operates with complete consistency at the classical level of physical reality. The barrier does not negotiate. The particle that lacks sufficient energy remains on its side of the barrier for as long as the disproportion between its energy and the barrier's height persists. It can accumulate more energy through conventional means, through acceleration, through heating, through external force, and eventually cross the barrier through the classical mechanism of having sufficient energy to overcome it. Or it can remain on its side of the barrier indefinitely. Those are, within classical mechanics, the only options. The analogy to karmic law is precise. The karmic pattern is the barrier established with a specific energetic threshold. Conventional effort, operating at the classical level of cause and effect, accumulates energy at the same level as the barrier and attempts to overcome the barrier through sufficient accumulation. This works sometimes with great expenditure of effort over great periods of time, or the practitioner remains on their side of the barrier indefinitely. Quantum tunneling is the experimentally verified phenomenon whereby a particle can cross an energy barrier without possessing the classical energy required to do so. This is not a theoretical prediction. It has been measured, documented, and technologically exploited in devices including the tunnel diode and the scanning tunneling microscope, which use tunneling as their operating principle. The phenomenon occurs because at the quantum level, the particle is not simply a classical object with a fixed position and a fixed energy. It is a probability wave that extends into and through the barrier region. At the quantum level, the barrier's authority over the particle's location is governed by laws fundamentally different from the classical laws that appear to prohibit crossing. The particle does not climb over the wall. It passes through it by virtue of operating at a level of description where the wall's prohibitive authority does not hold in the same absolute way. The quantum tunneling analogy to grace is not a loose metaphor. It carries structural precision. The karmic pattern, the energy barrier, was established and is maintained at a specific level of the consciousness system, operating according to the laws of cause and effect that govern that level. Conventional effort applied at that same level cannot tunnel through the barrier. It can only accumulate energy against it, attempting to overcome it through force applied from the same side. But the law of grace, in Shinn's teaching, does not operate at the same level as the pattern it supersedes. It operates at what she called the level of first cause, a level of the consciousness system that stands above the level at which the karmic pattern has its authority. In the same way that quantum mechanics describes a level of physical reality that stands above the level at which classical mechanical laws have their authority. At the level of first cause, the karmic barrier does not have the same prohibitive authority it exercises at the level of cause and effect. Grace does not accumulate conventional energy to overcome the barrier. Grace invokes the law at the level where the barrier's authority does not apply. This parallel has been noted by serious scholars working at the intersection of quantum physics and consciousness research, and while the scientific consensus on the role of quantum effects in consciousness remains appropriately cautious, the structural parallel between quantum tunneling and the phenomenon of sudden, unexpected pattern dissolution following spiritual invocation is striking. The common human experience of a problem that has resisted every conventional effort suddenly resolving through a mechanism that defies the causal logic of the conventional efforts. An unexpected contact, an inexplicable shift in circumstance, a resolution that arrives not through the gradual accumulation of effort, but through what can only be described as a discontinuous jump from one state to another. This experience has the functional signature of tunneling. The barrier was not overcome through accumulation. It was bypassed through an operative principle that does not recognize the barrier's classical authority. Shinn was working in the early decades of the 20th century when quantum mechanics was in its earliest formulation. She was not drawing on quantum physics as a source. She was documenting what she observed. But what she observed, the consistent, repeatable dissolution of long-established patterns following the correct invocation of grace, without the gradual accumulation of compensatory experience that conventional karmic theory would require, is precisely the functional description of a process operating by a different set of laws from those that establish the pattern. Whether the mechanism is quantum tunneling in the literal physical sense or an analogous process operating in the substrate of consciousness is a question that remains open at the frontier of scientific inquiry. What is not open in the framework of Shinn's documented teaching is the operational reliability of the effect. The barrier yielded, the pattern dissolved, the sentence was revoked. The law of grace, correctly invoked, produced its result with the same consistency that any correctly invoked law produces its result. The most significant implication of the quantum tunneling parallel for the practitioner is the one that most directly addresses the repayment posture identified in Part 4. Quantum tunneling does not require the particle to first accumulate sufficient energy to overcome the barrier classically before it can tunnel. If it had sufficient classical energy to overcome the barrier, it would not need to tunnel. It would simply overcome. Tunneling is precisely the mechanism by which the barrier is crossed in the absence of sufficient classical energy for conventional crossing. The relevance to grace is exact. If conventional effort, the classical energy of personal, will applied through affirmation, visualization, belief clearing, were sufficient to dissolve the karmic pattern, grace would not be required. Grace is precisely the mechanism that operates when conventional energy is insufficient, when the barrier has exceeded the reach of classical accumulation. The repayment posture, which requires the accumulation of sufficient conventional suffering before grace can legitimately operate, is equivalent to requiring the quantum particle to accumulate sufficient classical energy before it is permitted to tunnel. It misunderstands the mechanism at a fundamental level. Tunneling is the alternative to classical accumulation. Grace is the alternative to karmic repayment. They are not sequential options. They are different laws operating by different principles. The scientific framework also illuminates the non-local quality of grace's operation. The fact, documented consistently in Shinn's work and in the broader New Thought tradition, that the invocation of grace frequently produces resolutions that operate across domains of experience simultaneously. A financial pattern dissolves at the same time as a health pattern shifts and a relational dynamic restructures. The practitioner addressed only one of these explicitly in the invocation, yet all three responded. This simultaneous multi-domain shift is the functional signature of an intervention operating at the level of the underlying system rather than at the level of any individual symptom. In systems terms, it is the signature of a change at the level of the operating code rather than a change to any particular output. Shinn understood this and taught it. The law of grace correctly invoked does not operate surgically on the specific pattern named in the decree to the exclusion of all related patterns. It operates at the level of the consciousness system, dissolving whatever karmic structure is present that is ready to yield to the superseding authority. The practitioner who invokes grace for one pattern may find several patterns shifting simultaneously, not because the invocation exceeded its specified scope, but because the authority invoked operates above the level of specific patterns entirely. This multi-domain effect is both a confirmation of grace's operation and a diagnostic tool. When the practitioner observed shifts in areas of their experience they did not specifically address in the invocation, They are observing the signature of an intervention operating above the level of cause and effect, the signature of the law of grace at work. Shinn taught her students to pay particular attention to these peripheral shifts in the period following invocation, not as evidence to be monitored anxiously, but as confirmation to be received with quiet recognition. The confirmation is not for the purpose of increasing the practitioner's faith. They have already invoked the law, and the invocation was already complete before the confirmation appeared. The confirmation is for the purpose of deepening the practitioner's understanding of the law's operational reality, of building the body of first-person evidence that makes future invocations progressively more precise and progressively more complete. Each confirmed invocation becomes part of the retrospective record that Shinn identified as the foundation of the master practitioner's relationship to grace. The evidence accumulates, the understanding deepens, the authority of the invocation grows. The final scientific observation relevant to the grace principle is the concept of decoherence, the phenomenon whereby quantum systems that are maintaining a coherent quantum state lose that coherence through interaction with the classical environment and collapse into classical behavior. A quantum system that is coherent is capable of tunneling. A decoherent quantum system has lost the quantum properties that make tunneling possible and behaves entirely classically, which means it is subject to the barrier rather than capable of transcending it. The grace parallel is, again, structurally precise. The consciousness that has established the internal condition of genuine surrender, that has released personal will management and opened the channel to the superseding authority, is in a state of coherence with the level at which grace operates. The consciousness that has reintroduced monitoring, anxiety, conditional release, or the repayment posture has undergone the equivalent of decoherence. It has collapsed back into classical operation, which means it is now operating at the level of cause and effect rather than the level of grace. And the barrier that grace was invoked to supersede has regained its classical authority. Maintaining coherence, maintaining the state of genuine surrender and watchful non-interference is not merely a spiritual nicety following the invocation. It is the mechanism by which the invocation continues to be operative rather than collapsing back into the classical system it was designed to supersede. There is a woman whose case Shinn discussed not as an abstract illustration, but as a documented outcome of the specific application of the principles she taught. A practitioner who had experienced a pattern of financial loss for more than 30 years in a form so architecturally consistent that she had begun to document it herself with the clinical precision of someone who had moved beyond the distress of repetition into a kind of exhausted scientific observation. The pattern was not poverty. She was careful to distinguish that. The pattern was specific, the accumulation of financial reserves to a particular threshold, not a fixed number, but a consistent level relative to her circumstances, followed by a sudden, unanticipated event or cluster of events that returned the balance to near zero. The mechanism changed each time. A medical emergency, a business partner's unexpected departure, a market correction precisely timed to affect her holdings at maximum exposure, a family obligation that absorbed exactly the amount that had accumulated, different surface causes, identical essential architecture. She had documented this pattern through 4 complete cycles across 32 years, 3 careers, 2 countries, and more investment in conventional and metaphysical resolution than she could accurately account for. She had done, in Shinn's assessment, everything that the conventional and metaphysical literature prescribed. She had identified the childhood belief systems around money that corresponded to the pattern and systematically dismantled them using every available technique. She had worked with practitioners skilled in various modalities of belief clearing, emotional release, and somatic healing. She had maintained abundance consciousness with a discipline that even Shinn found remarkable. Affirmations performed daily without interruption across years. Visualization practices she had developed into a precise and detailed morning ritual. Charitable giving, calculated to activate the law of circulation. Gratitude practices maintained even at the lowest points of the pattern cycle. She was, by any measure, among the most conscientious practitioners Shinn had encountered, and the pattern had dissolved and reconstituted itself 4 times in 32 years, with the impassive fidelity of a law that had noted none of these efforts. When she arrived at Shinn's teaching on the law of grace, she brought with her both the exhaustion of decades of sincere, unproductive effort and the intellectual clarity that decades of careful observation of a single pattern had produced. She understood the pattern's architecture with precision. She had no illusions about the adequacy of personal effort to address it. She had applied every tool available at the level of personal effort and had the 4 documented cycles to demonstrate the results. She was, in Shinn's words, ideally prepared for the invocation of grace, not because she had finally accumulated sufficient spiritual merit, but because she had arrived at the precise condition of genuine surrender. Not the defeated surrender of exhaustion, but the clear-eyed recognition of a practitioner who understood, with clinical accuracy, that the pattern was operating at a level that personal effort could not reach, and that the correct response to that recognition was the invocation of the law, designed to operate at that level. She performed the grace invocation protocol. She described the experience afterward with an honesty that Shinn considered as important as the outcome. It was profoundly anticlimactic. There was no emotional intensity, no spiritual breakthrough feeling, no sense of dramatic shift in the fabric of reality. It was quiet, almost administrative, she said. The word she repeated was administrative. She named the pattern precisely. She acknowledged its operation beyond the reach of personal effort, without shame and without resentment, with the tone of someone reading a document. She spoke the grace declaration once, from what she described as a state of genuine emptiness. Not emotional distress, not spiritual exaltation, but a simple, clear quality of having released her hold on the outcome entirely. And then she returned to her life. She did not monitor the situation. She did not look for early evidence of the revocation. She had issued the decree and surrendered management of its execution to the authority she had invoked. That was all. 18 months after the invocation, she undertook the review of her financial situation that she had been conducting periodically throughout the 32 years of the pattern's operation. The clinical review that had allowed her to document its 4 complete cycles with precision. The review revealed that the threshold, the specific level at which accumulation had always in every previous cycle encountered its dissolution mechanism, had been crossed. The reserves had exceeded it. She had not been monitoring this. She had simply lived her life with the watchful non-interference that genuine surrender produces. The threshold had been crossed, and nothing had happened at the threshold. The dissolution mechanism had not deployed. There was no medical emergency, no business disruption, no market event, no family obligation. The threshold that had functioned as the architectural keystone of a 32-year pattern had, in the 18 months following the grace invocation, become simply a number that her financial situation had passed through without event. She went back through her records to confirm what she thought she was seeing. The threshold was absent, not present in a new form, not displaced to a higher level, not temporarily suspended. Absent. The architectural feature that had structured the financial dimension of her life across 4 decades had been dissolved. The revocation had been operative. The sentence had been dissolved. What Shinn emphasized in this case, and what distinguishes it as an illustration of grace rather than as an illustration of conventional affirmative practice, was the specific quality of the invocation that had made it effective where 32 years of sincere conventional effort had not. It was not more effort. It was not more sincerity. It was not more sophisticated technique. It was the precise establishment of the conditions grace requires, the genuine acknowledgement of the pattern's operation beyond personal effort's reach, the complete surrender of personal will management, the single clear declaration from the position of genuine openness, and the sustained non-monitoring release of the outcome. These conditions, correctly established, had invoked a law operating above the level at which the pattern had its authority. The pattern had no response to that law. It simply ceased. The administrative quality she had described as anticlimactic was not a deficiency of the experience. It was the signature of a law operating without drama, because it was operating at a level where the pattern's resistance had no standing to oppose it. Grace does not struggle against the karmic pattern. It simply supersedes it, and the supersession, correctly performed, has the quiet quality of a higher authority issuing a command that a lower authority cannot refuse. Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching on the law of grace stands as the most radical claim in the entire lineage of New Thought metaphysics, more radical than the law of attraction in its conventional form, more radical than prosperity consciousness, more radical than the positive thinking tradition in any of its expressions. Every other teaching in the New Thought tradition, however sophisticated, operates at the level of cause and effect, at the level of changing what you hold in consciousness in order to change what you experience in the world. These are legitimate teachings that produce genuine results, and they deserve the credit they receive. But they operate within the system of karma. They are, in the precise technical sense, methods of improving your performance within the law of cause and effect, rather than methods of superseding that law. Shinn did not dismiss those methods. She used them herself, but she recognized that they had a ceiling, a specific level of depth below which they could not reach, and that for the practitioner whose pattern was established below that ceiling, no amount of improved performance within the system would address the cause. Something above the system was required. Grace is that something. The implication of this teaching is more radical than it initially appears, and it should be held in consciousness long enough for its full weight to be felt. Shinn was declaring that the practitioner is not subject to the full karmic consequence of every pattern established in consciousness before the current moment of understanding. This is not a theological promise about forgiveness in the afterlife. This is not a comforting reassurance that divine mercy will eventually balance the scales. This is an operative claim about a mechanism available in the present moment, that the accumulated record of consciousness, however long, however complex, however deeply it has structured the external experience, is subject to a law that can dissolve it unconditionally without repayment, without earned worthiness, without the passage of time. The karmic record is real. The patterns it has generated are real. The costs those patterns have imposed across decades are real. And the grace that supersedes all of it is more real, because it operates at the level from which all of it derives its existence. This is the teaching that reorganizes everything, not because it eliminates responsibility. Shinn was deeply committed to the principle of personal responsibility for the conditions of consciousness, but because it eliminates the fatalistic conclusion that responsibility implies the conclusion that you must therefore serve the full consequence of everything you have established, consciously or unconsciously, in the history of your consciousness. Responsibility without the law of grace leads to the practitioner's exhausted resignation to the pattern as the consequence they are owed. Responsibility, understood in the full context of the law of grace, leads to something entirely different. The recognition that you are responsible for invoking the superseding authority, responsible for establishing the conditions of correct invocation, responsible for maintaining the posture of genuine surrender following the invocation. The responsibility has not disappeared. Its domain has shifted from the exhausting obligation to serve the sentence to the sovereign opportunity to revoke it. The synthesis of Shinn's teaching, stated in its most reduced and most essential form, is this: you came into this life with a karmic record. That record has been generating patterns in your experience with mechanical fidelity. You have been applying the best tools available at the level of cause and effect to address those patterns, and some of those efforts have produced genuine progress. But certain patterns, the deepest ones, the most persistent ones, the ones that have reconstituted themselves across different circumstances with the same essential architecture, have exceeded the reach of those tools. For those patterns, the law of grace exists. It has always existed. It exists above the level of cause and effect, above the level of karmic law, above the level of any pattern established in the history of your consciousness. It requires no preliminary suffering, no demonstrated worthiness, no passage of time. It requires only the precise invocation of a consciousness that understands its authority and establishes the conditions of that invocation with sufficient completeness. That consciousness is the one you have been developing your entire life. You have arrived at the moment of its correct application. The sentence is revocable. Revoke it. The moment of invocation is now, not after sufficient suffering, not after the demonstration of greater spiritual maturity, not after the pattern has run one more cycle to confirm that personal effort has truly been exhausted. Now, in the present moment of this understanding, with the mechanism precisely specified, with the authority clearly established, with the conditions of correct invocation fully described, the karmic pattern that has structured the most persistent dimension of your limitation has no defense against the authority you are now equipped to invoke. Grace does not require your worthiness. It requires your precision, and you now have the precision. The decree is available to you. Issue it. You are not serving a sentence you cannot appeal. This must be understood not as consolation, but as operational fact. The karmic pattern that has operated in your experience for years or decades, that has reconstituted itself in different forms with the same essential outcome, is not a permanent feature of your reality. It is a temporary feature of your experience, maintained by the unrevoked presence of its original cause, subject to dissolution by the invocation of a law that operates above the level at which it was established. Its apparent permanence is not evidence of its actual permanence. It is evidence that it has not yet been correctly superseded. That is a correctable condition. You are not paying a debt whose terms were set before you arrived with no mechanism of appeal. The terms were set by a law, and law is not personal. Law is mechanical. It operates without malice, without favoritism, and without the kind of stubborn insistence on full payment that the pattern's persistence can make it appear to embody. The pattern has persisted not because it is determined to continue or because some cosmic authority is demanding its completion. It has persisted because the law that established it continues to operate where it has not been superseded, in the same way that a program continues to run where it has not been interrupted by a more authoritative command. You now have the more authoritative command. The program does not negotiate with the command that supersedes it. It yields. You are not trapped in a pattern that has more authority over your life than the law that was designed to dissolve it. The authority of the karmic pattern, however it has felt across the years of its operation, is derivative. It derives from the law of cause and effect, which is itself derived from the infinite first cause. Grace, which operates from the level of first cause directly, does not derive its authority from the same source that derived the karmic law. It is the source. The pattern's authority is borrowed. The authority of grace is original. When the original authority is invoked, the borrowed authority yields. This is not a spiritual metaphor. It is the operational logic of how layered authority systems function in every domain where they have been studied. Stop accepting the pattern as your fate. The acceptance posture, the quiet resignation that develops across years of a persistent pattern's operation, the private conclusion that this is simply how your life is constructed, that this particular dimension of your experience is not available to you, is itself the primary mechanism by which the karmic law maintains its authority in the absence of a superseding invocation. Acceptance is the absence of decree, and in the absence of decree, the pattern runs. The acceptance posture and the grace invocation are mutually exclusive. You cannot occupy both simultaneously. The moment you issue the grace declaration with the completeness and precision that Shinn specified, you have ceased to accept the pattern as fate. You have placed it under the authority of the law that supersedes it. The acceptance ends the moment the decree begins. Stop interpreting the recurring loss as evidence of unworthiness. This interpretation, the conclusion that the persistent pattern represents the universe's judgment of your spiritual adequacy, your personal merit, your fundamental worthiness of a better experience, is among the most damaging misapplications of the karmic concept that Shinn spent her career correcting. The pattern does not correspond to your worth. It corresponds to an unrevoked cause established in the history of your consciousness, possibly before you had any conscious role in establishing it. It is a mechanical fact about the current state of your consciousness system, not a verdict on your character. The practitioner who has spent decades interpreting the karmic pattern as evidence of unworthiness has been, with every iteration of that interpretation, reinforcing precisely the belief structure that prevents the invocation of grace. Because the belief in unworthiness is itself the primary support of the repayment posture. You must be worthy before you can invoke grace, and since the pattern continues, you must not yet be worthy. The circle maintains itself. It is not a logical circle. It is a self-reinforcing error. Break it cleanly. The pattern is not a verdict. It is a mechanical condition, and mechanical conditions yield to correct application of the appropriate law. Stop waiting for the debt to be repaid through suffering you did not design. The waiting posture is the pattern's most efficient maintenance mechanism because it transforms the practitioner from an agent capable of invoking the superseding law into a passive recipient of the pattern's continuing operation. Every day of waiting is a day in which the grace invocation was available and was not performed. Every year of waiting is a year in which the mechanism of supersession existed and was not engaged. Shinn's entire teaching on grace is an instruction to stop waiting, to recognize that the law is available now, that the invocation is accessible now, that the authority required for the revocation has never required the accumulation of sufficient suffering to legitimate itself. The debt does not become more revocable through suffering. The grace invocation is equally available on the first day of the pattern's recognition as on the 1000th. What changes with understanding is not the law's availability, but the practitioner's readiness to invoke it correctly. You are now ready. Invoke it. The mechanism is precise, it is accessible, and it is operative the moment you use it correctly. The sentence is revocable. Revoke it now. The specific instruction for this moment is not a general call to greater spiritual aspiration. It is a precise operational directive. Identify the pattern with the specificity this teaching has described. Perform the acknowledgement with the honest precision this teaching has specified. Speak the grace declaration once from the position of genuine surrender, with the certainty of someone invoking a law they understand to be real, and release the outcome completely, its form, its timeline, its mechanism, into the hands of the authority you have just invoked. Do these 4 things. Do them with the precision this teaching has provided. That is all. The law will do what the law is designed to do. It has always been designed to do this. You have now been given the understanding to engage it correctly. The pattern ends where the invocation begins. Begin. The work of this video does not end when the video ends. It ends when you perform the one action that converts understanding into operation, the action that moves the law of grace from a principle you have encountered to a law you have actively invoked. This is the karmic pattern recognition challenge, and it is not a journaling exercise. It is a legal proceeding performed in the court of your own consciousness with the authority of a law that has been established and documented and shown to produce its results in the lives of practitioners no more equipped than you are right now. Here is the precise form of the challenge. Identify one pattern in your experience that carries the specific signature of karmic operation. It has persisted across multiple configurations. It has reconstituted itself in different surface circumstances with the same essential outcome, and it has remained architecturally intact despite your most sincere and sustained efforts at transformation. You know this pattern. You have known it for years. You have perhaps known it so long that it has begun to feel like a feature of your identity rather than a pattern in your experience. Name it with the precision of a legal document. What it is, how long it has operated, the threshold or the mechanism through which it has repeatedly expressed itself, and what it has cost you across those years. Write it in those terms, not as a story, not as a complaint, as a precise architectural description of a mechanism that has been running in your experience and that you are about to formally revoke. Then beneath it, write these words, not as an aspiration, not as an affirmation, as a decree. This pattern is hereby revoked. The law of grace supersedes every karmic authority that has maintained it. Divine order is now the only operative law in this area of my life. Write it, and then speak it aloud, once, from the position of genuine surrender, with the certainty of someone invoking a law they understand to be real. And then release it. Set down the document. Do not monitor it. Do not look for evidence of its operation. Return to the living of your life with the quality of watchful non-interference that Shinn identified as the correct posture of a practitioner who has correctly invoked a law they trust to execute. The law will do the rest. It was designed for exactly this. In the comments below, there is one action that will complete the circuit of this understanding in a way that no private note can fully accomplish. Write the specific karmic pattern you are revoking today, not as something you are hoping will change, not as something you are working on, not as an intention you are setting. State it as something you are formally and legally dissolving through the invocation of grace, effective from this moment. Write it in the past tense if you need to practice the certainty of the law. The pattern of X is revoked. Write it as a decree, not for the channel, not for the audience, for your own subconscious record, because the decree you issue in a witness space carries a different quality than the decree you issue in private silence. And Shinn documented that the act of formal witness declaration has a specific function in the mechanics of the invocation. It seals the intention at the level of the deep subjective mind with an authority that the private intention, however sincere, does not always establish completely. The comment is the witness. The witness decree is the seal. The next teaching in this laboratory addresses the mechanism that Shinn considered the law of grace's most powerful companion principle. The law she called the law of divine design, which operates not merely to dissolve what should not be, but to establish with precision what should be. Where grace revokes the karmic sentence, the law of divine design specifies what replaces it. And the replacement, in Shinn's teaching, is not a negotiated compromise between what the personal will desires and what the karmic record permits. It is what she called the perfect self-expression, the exact form of life that your particular consciousness was designed to embody in full, without diminishment. That is the next subject of examination. It is built on the foundation you have established today. Before you encounter it, seal this one. The pattern is revoked. Invoke the law now. Before you leave this space, there is one thing that will seal this understanding more permanently than any note you could take, more durably than any intellectual agreement with the principles presented here. Think of one specific moment in your life, one moment where this law was already at work, whether or not you recognized it at the time. A moment where a pattern that had every logical reason to continue according to its established trajectory simply did not. A moment where a resolution arrived through a mechanism you could not account for. A moment where a door opened, a cost was avoided, a consequence was superseded by something that operated outside the system of causes you had been working within. Write it in the comments, not for the channel, for yourself, because the consciousness that can identify the law of grace operating in its own past has just acquired something that no teaching, however precise, can fully substitute for. The first-person recognition that this law is real, that it has already operated in your experience, and that it is therefore available to be invoked consciously going forward. That recognition is not the end of the initiation. It is the beginning of mastery.